Hi everyone, my name's Sam, and today we're going to do a presentation on pollinators. First of all, I hope you and your families are staying well and staying safe in these times. My background with pollinators began about 5 years ago volunteering with the Environmental Youth Alliance. They do a lot of work in gardens and focus on bees and their importance. So I've had a lot of experience learning about pollinators and observing them, so I hope you like this presentation. So today we're going to talk about pollinators and their ecology, so how they live. So a bit of an overview about what we'll be talking about. First, we're going to describe what a pollinator is. Then we're going to talk about pollination, what process that is. We're going to talk about the role of pollinators in their ecosystems and why they're important. We'll also look at different types of pollinators, including bees and flies. And we're going to learn about their identifying features and how we can protect them because they're very important. So does anyone know what a pollinator is? I'll give you a pause and let you discuss that with the group. Now on to the first step. We've got pollination. So here's a flower that I drew. And a flower has a few main aspects. You've got the male and female parts, let's say. So the male parts contains the pollen. So these are called the anthers. So these little orange specks represent the pollen. So when a bee, if the bee was my cursor, comes in, it's going to go for the pollen because that's a protein source. And then it'll go to another flower, say this is another flower, and then it might drop pollen or inadvertently have that pollen touch the stigma, which is the female part. So what will happen then is that pollen will come down this tube and it'll reach the ovule, and that is how the plant will be pollinated. So the fruit or seed will be developed down here. So what pollinators do is they come to collect either nectar, which is further down here in the flower, or pollen, and they accidentally transfer it to the stigma. So that's how pollination works. So why are pollinators important? At first glance, you might see insects and you don't necessarily know why they're important, but they do a lot. So here's a little bit of a chart. We'll talk about it more, but you can see here, 85% of plants exist because of pollinators. So that's a lot of plants. 1/3 of the food we depend on. So 1 of every 3 bites you eat is dependent on pollinators. And more than 100 crops, so the food we eat, depend on pollinators. So there aren't just bees, there's also other pollinators. So does anyone know what that is? So that's a butterfly. So this is a mourning cloak. Anyone know what this is? That's a hummingbird. So they use their long beaks to get nectar deep inside flowers and inadvertently pollinate plants. Does anyone know what this is? Now that's a wasp. So the wasps are going after nectar and pollinating at the same time. So bees are the only insects that are actually going to get pollen as a food source. The others are going to get nectar and pollinate by accident. So there are several families of bees. So you've got families of bees that we'll go through, but a quick overview. You've got the Apidae, which include bumblebees and honeybees, Megachilidae, which include mason bees and leafcutter bees, Halictidae, which include sweat bees, and Andrenidae, which include mining bees. So these are all different kinds of bees because there's a great diversity and variety. So first, let's talk about bumblebees and honeybees. I'm sure you've seen these outside. Honeybees, they create honey, as their name implies. And bumblebees are quite large, especially the queens, and quite fuzzy. So what are some of the identifying features in this family? Well, both of these species, bumblebees and honeybees, carry the pollen on what we call pollen baskets on the thighs of their back legs. And like all bees, they have 2 sets of wings on each side. So they have 4 wings in total, whereas flies have 2, which we'll talk about later. And the bumblebees are quite distinctive because they've got a very fuzzy abdomen, so their end part here. So that's a bit of an overview of these bees. And these bees are also distinct. They've got longer tongues, which we'll get to later. So here's the family Megachilidae, also known as hairy belly bees. And they're called that because they carry the pollen that they collect on the hairs on their bellies. So here we've got mason bees. So they're one type of hairy-bellied bee. So here's a bit of the process of how they function. So here we see a mother bee coming in, and here we've got an egg that she's laid. And what happens next is she creates these mud walls, and these mud walls separate each egg she'd laid. Now all of this brownish that you see, that is all pollen that she's deposited. So as the young bees develop, they'll feed on that pollen as they grow, and they'll be inside these cells, and then they'll emerge next spring. So these are very hardworking bees, and they're 10 times more efficient than honeybees. So here's another view that's going to show us their hairy belly. So right here, you can see all that pollen, that's on her belly right there. So that's how they carry the pollen, make these big pollen balls to feed their developing larvae. The next family of bees are called sweat bees. And these bees are distinctive because they carry the pollen on hairs that go all along their legs. So we can call these pollen pants. And these bees, they nest underground. So as we can see with the mason bees, they go in cavities, so natural holes in trees or boxes that we can put out. Whereas mining bees, they make their nests underground. So they mine their nests out. And they carry their pollen along here, so they're pollen pants. So they're quite distinct if you see all these hairs, or you see pollen being collected along the length of their hairs. And mining bees are very similar. There's just a few differences, but once again, they have pollen pants like this. They nest underground, and right here you can see all those hairs that carry the pollen along their legs. So sweat bees and mining bees are quite similar. So I talked a bit about how honeybees and bumblebees had longer tongues. So this brings me to how bees have preferred flowers, because each of these bees have adapted to feed on certain flowers. So different parts of their bodies, like their tongues, have adapted so they can feed on these flowers. So tongue length is important. So some flowers are more suitable for some bees than others. So here we have deep flowers, so those are more suitable for bumblebees that have longer tongues. Whereas asters or daisies, like you see here, they're more suited for mining bees because they have a shorter tongue, so they can't access the nectar that's deeper inside, so they depend on shallower flowers. So that's why planting a variety of flowers that bloom through the year are important, and different types of flowers that will suit different types of bees, since there's that diversity. And there's not only bees. This might look like a bee, but it's not. I call these wannabes. These are actually hoverflies. So they're flies that have, why do you think that they've adapted to have the colors of a bee or a wasp? So the reason they've done that is to look predatory. They're very innocent, they cannot sting, but having those colors in nature, having reds, yellows, and blacks, that's a symbol of danger. So these flies have gotten those colors to protect themselves from predators, so they look dangerous. But we can identify these from bees in the different ways. The easiest part is looking at their head. So I said that bees have 4 wings and flies have 2 wings, but that's harder to see. But if you look at a hoverfly, their eyes take up a huge amount of their head, whereas bees have smaller eyes. And bees have longer antennae, whereas hoverflies have these short antennae. So that's an easy way. If you see big eyes that take up most of the head and really stubby antennae, that's a sign that it could be a hoverfly. So let's review why they're important. We can have a discussion about this too at this point. So briefly, we'll go over this little image again. So 85% of plants that feed us, plants that create forests, depend on pollination. 1 out of every 3 bites of food we eat depend on those pollinators, and so many crops that we eat and that are important to livestock are due to pollination. So how can we protect them? Does anyone have any ideas? So a few ideas are planting flowers that have a bloom period throughout from spring to late summer. That means that we can feed the bees all summer. And we can also plant different flowers, so flowers that have shallower flowers and some with deeper, to accommodate the mining bees that we looked at and the bumblebees. And we can also not use pesticides in our garden, because that will affect bees that come to feed on the flowers that we've used pesticides on. And we can just create natural habitats where we plant flowers and we plant plants that attract these important creatures. So here are a few examples of different flowers that are native to our region, and all of these will be pollinated by insects. So protecting pollinators, here's another little image so we can plant lots of different plants. Like I said, we can lay off the spray and go organic, so don't use harmful pesticides, and create habitat for the bees. So here you can see that since there's not a huge availability in the city of cavities for mason bees to use, you can buy these little homes, and they have cavities that are about 6 inches deep, and the mason bees will build their homes in there. That's what you saw earlier in that video. So thank you for listening, and I hope you learned about pollinators. Hope you learned something valuable about pollinators, and I hope you have a good end of your school year. I hope you're doing well. I hope you're staying safe and you're learning and staying curious.